So we're very excited to be talking today with Mayor Peter Buttigieg about Kant, Rawls, and how philosophy guides local government. Now, Peter is the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, a city of about 100,000 some residents. And when he's not busy mayoring, he's also a lieutenant in the Naval Reserve Officer Corps. So Peter, we're really excited to talk with you about this. I'm particularly excited because we've known each other since 2005 when we were in the same Rhodes Scholar cohort. Now we're back together in South Bend.
That's right.
Talking about philosophy like we were so many years ago. Peter, you were a history and literature major in college, and then when you went on to Oxford, you studied philosophy, politics, and economics. So you have this really broad base in the liberal arts. Question to get us going, how do you think studying philosophy has helped prepare you for a career in government?
Well, in a couple of ways. First of all, I think the style of studying philosophy is great preparation because in philosophy, you're breaking down some of the biggest, most complex problems in the world, and you're wrangling them down to the size where you can talk about them, think about them, argue about them. And in many ways, that's what you do in public service. You know, just like in philosophy, you're taking on these huge questions. What is the nature of time? Is there a God? What is the right thing to do? I mean, here we're looking at questions like, what does it mean to have a good city? Are we doing the right thing for 100,000 people? You know, where are we headed as a community? How do we deal with poverty and violence? You know, these are issues that you really need to be prepared to attack, even knowing that they're enormous and you can't, you know, fit them all into one thought at a time. So I think philosophy gave me a good toolkit for that. And in many ways, I think the work that I do day to day is a kind of applied philosophy because philosophers were very concerned about the right thing to do and the good life. And that's what we spend a lot of our time here in this office thinking about too. The right thing to do for those of us in public service and the good life for everybody we're trying to help.
That's fantastic. When I first approached you about doing this interview, I gave you a list of some of the philosophers that we're tackling in our class and asked if any of these philosophers you thought their work or ideas shaped some of the issues that you face leading a local government. And you suggested that we talk about Immanuel Kant, which was really ambitious, because Kant is a tough philosopher. He's really important, but also sometimes a difficult philosopher to wrestle with. We've been reading Kant in class, and one of the things we've been talking about is how Kant has he sees this really close connection between morality, rationality, and the notion of government. Kant thinks it really matters what your reasons are for acting, both as an individual and if you eventually find yourself in a leadership role. And one of Kant's distinctive views is that you can't act morally if your reasons for acting aren't universalizable. They're not the kinds of reasons that any other rational person could recognize as being a reason. And to kind of test this, Kant says you should imagine yourself like as a mayor or as a lawgiver, somebody who's thinking, look, if everybody started acting on this reason the way I'm thinking of acting on it, would that be a kind of world that I would want to live in? So for instance, you can say, like, imagine as an individual, you're deciding whether or not you should lie to someone to spare their feelings. Kant says, look, in this particular case, it might seem like it's a good thing to do because you'll be helping out your friend. But if you imagined making it a law that everybody lied whenever feelings would be spared, you might end up in a world where there wasn't a lot of trust, and that wouldn't be a kind of world that you'd want to live in. So lying's not going to pass the universalizability test. I wonder, you know, it's sometimes hard to understand this concept of universalizability, but do you think there are areas in local politics or the kind of moral issues you face as a local leader where universalizability becomes a big issue?
In a way, yes. I think whenever you're undertaking a policy move or pushing the community in a certain direction, you need to make sure that you're doing it for reasons you can defend. And in a way, that means being able to explain what you're doing in universal terms. Being able to say that, you know, we're pursuing this course of action because this is what we think anyone in this position would do. We think it's just plain the right thing to do. And so I might not use the vocabulary of, you know, this being universal law. Might make it sound like I'm getting a little bit outside the boundaries of my job as mayor.
You don't talk about maxims at all in your typical day-to-day
Not
stuff?
very frequently.
No, fair enough.
But we do think about, you know, making sure that you know, we're making decisions that we think would be the reasonable thing to do if you really looked at the problem from all sides.
And one way of reading Kant on this point is he sometimes thinks that there's a tension between finding something that's right to do in particular circumstances, but would be totally wrong to make into a policy. So I wonder if you see this tension ever playing out in issues that government faces.
Well, I think it happens a lot in day-to-day practice because, you know, government and especially politics is largely the art of convincing people and getting them to do something, maybe to agree with you on something. There's a lot of horse trading that goes on, right? And so you're often negotiating with your own commitments and your own value set as you venture out into others. If I'm dealing with a member of the Common Council, for example, whose vote I need in order to get something through, the importance of dealing with them in a level fashion goes much further than the individual kind of ethics of that specific case I'm dealing with, because that's going to have broader repercussions in our relationship and in the way I think people can relate to or can't relate to their government as a body that's acting, according to the principles that they'd like to see. We spend a lot of time thinking about process and procedure and making sure that we not only have the right outcome, but did we get there in the right way?
Yeah.
And often that's even more important, because the precedent you set on your way to an outcome could affect 100 future decisions that you haven't even thought of yet. And that's where a lot of the biggest consequences of your decisions actually cash out.
Let's talk about the getting there in the right way point, because this is also a crucial issue for somebody like Kant. Kant thinks that your decisions are moral only insofar as you're trying to follow the right principles. And even more controversially, he thinks the consequences of making your decisions, if they're out of your control, they're not the kinds of things that you're morally responsible for. You're just responsible for following your duty. So I think, in real life, we often hold people responsible, especially leaders, for both the intentions and the consequences of the policies that they enact. So, for instance, if the city of South Bend institutes a well-intentioned policy to help alleviate traffic, but because of some unforeseeable complication, it turns out increasing traffic accidents, we say the city is responsible, even though they couldn't foresee the consequences. Or vice versa, somebody like Kant would think you can imagine an elected official who launches a policy because she thinks it will just help her personal campaign, but it turns out to be enormously successful. Kant's going to say somewhat controversially that she doesn't deserve any credit for that policy. It's not something moral that she's done at all. I wonder if you think we should hold individuals or leaders more responsible for them intending to do the right thing, or more responsible for their consequences? And if there are ever any policies where you think this tension or this consideration between intentions and consequences are at odds?
I think in many ways a job like mine is necessarily utilitarian, because voters hold us accountable mostly for consequences, right? That's one way to think about it. But I think there's a broader picture, and this is why there's no easy answer to this, which is that a job like this has really two moods or two aspects. One is the technical, and one is the moral. So we spent a lot of time preoccupied with the technical aspects of the job. Did we or did we not correctly assess road conditions, for example? That's an example that hits close to home because we're reconfiguring a lot of roads in the city right now. Were we or were we not correct in believing that by addressing 1,000 vacant and abandoned homes, in the long term we would see safety and the value of homes in the immediate area begin to increase, right? These are things that admit of being right or wrong, mostly based on how they played out and whether they played out the way I've thought and said they would. And if they don't, I will be fired. That's how elections work. Now, the other aspect is the moral aspect, and I think that's actually the more interesting side of things, because technical solutions mostly have to do with creating a situation that makes everybody or most people better off. But moral choices come up when, among other things, when you have to make somebody worse off. And I think that's actually the reason that political leadership is the one job that's never been outsourced. You can't leave it to a formula, you can't leave it to a machine. We choose people to make these decisions because they're often moral decisions, and there's a lot of mischief done when you confuse one for the other. So I'm not sure many voters are actually, at the end of the day, that concerned with whether I had the right intentions in doing an action that did or didn't help them. But of course, personally, you have to be. Otherwise, you lose your way, and you lose touch with the moral roots that lead you to approach all the different questions you face in the way that you hopefully intended to when you ran for office in the first place.
One issue that comes out of this part of the discussion is what it means to respect somebody, like to respect your constituents, to respect somebody that you're dealing with morally. One theme that's big for both Kant and Rawls is that respecting somebody means respecting the fact that they're a rational, free agent. Kant is a big, big fan of rationality, but some people think he focuses too much on rationality at the expense of other things that make people who they are. So Kant thinks at the end of the day that we can't be taken seriously or respected for parts of our identity that are totally contingent or beyond our control. So this might mean identities like being an American, or being from South Bend, or being white or black, or being raised Catholic, or who you love, or which family you're part of. I think those are all really contingent features of who we are, and respecting us doesn't mean necessarily taking seriously those parts of our identity. Another way of putting this is, Kant thinks that nothing that goes into moral treatment of somebody or the moral evaluation of what we're doing can be lucky, can be something that just happened to us that we didn't exactly design or control on our own. So I think you might think there's a tension between that view of like really obsessive focus on rationality and the way that we ordinarily think of respect in political life. So for instance, we push in places like South Bend to have political leaders and city councils that represent the actual diversity in our society. We pay a lot of attention to people's contingent identities when we're deciding who's going to be a good representative. They also play a big role in our moral practices. So when we're deciding how to treat someone, we oftentimes do pay attention to where they're coming from, what their background is. I wonder what you make of this claim from Kant and some of his followers that the most important part of us is just our rational nature, our ability to respond to principles. Do you think Kant was missing out on something that was really important, or do you think at the end of the day, for morality's purposes, he was focused on the right thing?
In theory, I mostly agree.
With Kant?
Because when you're considering justice, and certainly when you're considering questions of law, it's very important that you treat everybody in a neutral fashion. We spend a lot of time trying to make sure that the policies we put forward are policies that benefit everybody, regardless of contingencies that don't have any moral weight. So we want to treat people the same regardless of their background, regardless of their race or sexual orientation or religion. We want them all to feel that they're being treated on an equal footing. But that's the theory. In practice, the truth is you can't totally abstract yourself from your own perspective. So if you're a human being who has a certain background, a certain race, a certain religion, and you're trying to make decisions for 100,000 people, many of whom you'll never even know, you have to find a way to inhabit their specific contingent realities in order to even build an understanding of what the big picture looks like. You can't do it all from first principles because your access to first principles, in my case, is mediated by the fact that I have a certain education, that I had a certain upbringing. I think often white people who claim to be colorblind get into trouble because one implication of that is that it's only other people who have race. The fact is all of us, for example, have a certain race that we come from. So I may do more good by spending time in the community among people with different racial backgrounds than I would if I tried to behave as though race didn't exist in our society. Because the reality is I too am affected by the limits of my own perspective and will only be able to glimpse the bigger picture by inhabiting the lived experiences of a lot of other people. And so while I think in theory, yes, you need to try to arrive at conclusions and commitments that make sense outside of anybody's particular background or experience, because that's what fairness is made of, I believe. In order to have access to that, in order to actually understand it, the best we can do is shine a flashlight around this big territory, starting with our own room that we grew up in, but shining it into other chambers by getting into other people's lives and seeing it there. That's why I spend so much time in different neighborhoods around the community and try to really live into the experiences of all the diverse groups that make up a community like ours, from immigrant neighborhoods where there are a lot of people from who are very new to the country, very vulnerable, to African-American neighborhoods and a lot of working class neighborhoods that are vulnerable in a very different way. It's the only way I know of to even begin to scrape at the kind of picture that Rawls and other people, or that Kant and people responding to him like Rawls, were talking about when they tried to envision this pure reasoning creature that we might all hope to be, but that I've never actually met one.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So if I was going to kind of summarize your point, you're saying you agree with Kant and with Rawls that what really matters is our ability to just appreciate our reasons, and reasons belong to everybody. But if we want to really respect another person's rationality, especially if they're coming from a really different place than we are, we've got to pay attention to contingent features of their identity insofar as like we're really likely to make mistakes about how we deal with them reasonably, unless we're paying attention to the fact that that there are these differences.
I think that's right, because even our access to reason
Yeah.
is mediated by some of our lived experiences. And you can't get away from that unless you at least multiply the lived experiences that you have access to by talking to other people. And that's politics in its best sense, I think, is living into the experiences of others and extending yourself to other people so that you can reason from a policy perspective with a wider understanding of the impact you're going to have and the virtues and values that you're trying to preserve.
So this is great, and it brings us to this issue of how John Rawls kind of embodies Kant's philosophy. So students have had just a little bit of exposure to Rawls at this point, but Rawls is a more contemporary philosopher. He's inspired by Kant. Kant talks about government in the sense that, he asks us to imagine that we're legislators when we're deciding whether or not a policy is a good one to follow. Rawls takes it a step further and says, no, if we took Kant's ideas seriously, how would we actually redesign political systems? And one of Rawls's big arguments and insights is that government should be operating with publicly accessible reasons. So if the government's going to institute a law or start a new policy, the arguments that it gives for starting that policy should be the kinds of arguments that anyone, regardless of their background, could think that's a good argument. A lot of people read Rawls, and he comes in for a lot of criticism, saying that's not actually how governments work. A lot of the times if we're debating a really morally serious policy, people are bringing in arguments and evidence from all different corners, and sometimes their ideas are not publicly accessible. So a really great example of this is people who use religious arguments to try to promote or refute certain policy proposals. Somebody like Kant and Rawls might think, look, those kinds of arguments, they're not allowed, or we're not engaging in public philosophy when we do that because we're appealing to reasons that not everybody can support in a really diverse society. I wonder if this issue of finding publicly accessible reasons, it's something that your office and city council thinks about. Is it the kind of thing that you think this is a demand the government really faces? We have to be able to give arguments for everything that we do that anybody in principle could support regardless of their background? Or do we have to sometimes make compromises?
In practice, I think you have to meet people where they are. Yeah. So the way I resolve this issue is I believe I have to be transparent about what my reasons are, but also tell other people some of the reasons maybe they should be on board, even if they're not the same as mine. So to take one example, as I said, we're making a lot of changes to the way our streets are laid out. Now, my main reasoning for this is I think it'll make our city healthier because it slows down traffic and encourages pedestrians, and so you have more of the exchange that makes cities a great place to live. But there might be others who aren't really interested or impressed by that because they believe the main road of streets is just to carry us through where we're going as quickly as possible. Now, I might point out to them that there's also a safety benefit to the measures that I'm introducing, because I think that'll be more persuasive to them. I've actually come at this not from the safety perspective first, but from the health of the city perspective. But if I know they're going to find the other reason more convincing, why shouldn't I introduce that reason into the conversation? I think the key is to be transparent about your own reasons, but you're not persuading if you're only talking about the reasons that make it obvious that something is the right thing to do to you. If that were the case, you wouldn't need to be persuading in the first place. Another great example that's very alive in our state right now is a debate over civil rights and inclusion. It was argued that it was good for our economy to have a civil rights bill across the state that would treat people with different sexual orientations and gender identities equally. And that's become actually the main argument that's being used, is an economic argument. I come at it from more of a moral perspective. I believe it's the right thing to do. But I won't hesitate to point to the economic argument if that's a way for other people using reason in their way to arrive at the same conclusion. I think where you get into mischief is if you pretend to be motivated. Each time you're in a different conversation with a different person, you pretend to be motivated by the exact same things that they are. Because and maybe this is a bit of universalizing principle,
yeah.
Actually. One rule I like to follow in political persuasion is, yes, you address each group as much as you can in their language and based on what they care about. But you never say anything to one group that you would be embarrassed to have repeated to a different one.
Yeah.
Because if you're doing that, that's a pretty good sign that there's something morally inconsistent about the way you're making the case for your aims.
I think that's a really good example of universalizability, and one Kant himself would definitely have endorsed. I wonder, So going back to this issue of public reason, I mean, we look at our country now, our state, people are really divided. There seems to be these really strong polls, at least the media presents it this way. A lot of people might look out at the United States right now, at Indiana, and say, look, Rawls' dream of us being able to come up with arguments that could in principle convince everyone is just exactly that. It's a dream. It's completely impractical given how many different identities and how divided we are right now. Are you more optimistic or pessimistic about our ability to actually follow philosophers like Kant and Rawls when we're doing the day-to-day business of governing?
In the long run, I'm optimistic because I believe that if we continue to present the right reasons for doing the right thing, over time these become convincing. They'll be convincing to some because they can get on board with the theory and the reasons that we're offering up. They'll be convincing to others simply because their lives got better. There are some people in this community who I think supported my reelection, even though they were very skeptical about some of the specific ideas I introduced, because of a more broader feeling that the community is doing better. And you get credit for that, even if people aren't so sure about the way you got there, aligning with their own individual political or personal commitments. I'll admit that this is maybe more of a Hume season than a Kant season lately,
no.
because let's face it. I mean, slaves of the passions seem to be carrying the day in our national politics. Yeah. But I also think the closer you get to the local level, the less that you're dealing with passion, the less you're dealing with mood, because you're really accountable for results. There's a famous saying by a mayor that there's no Republican way to fill in a pothole or Democratic way to pick up trash. You just have to get it done. And so, in that sense, we are kind of redeemed by our results. The hope, of course, is that the results and the consequences on the ground align with having done the right thing for the right reason in the first place. And I think as long as we are able to move in that direction and explain why, then I think over time people feel better. When people feel bad, it's usually because something specific is going wrong in their lives. And that, I think, is what's happening in this economy, in this country right now. And it is holding our politics back and making it tough to establish the kind of reasoned discourse that we'd like our political sphere to be built around.
That's fantastic. Can we finish maybe by talking about South Bend? So I had one maybe cheeky question I wanted to finish with, which is, what do you think is the biggest philosophical problem that's facing our city right now? Or one of the biggest, because sometimes it's hard to narrow it down.
Well, I think the biggest challenge any mayor faces really is keeping a sense of a whole in the community. And this has a lot of specific implications, including harmony among different kinds of groups and dealing with inequality, which certainly exists when we're trying to make a choice about maybe something that would benefit the downtown area versus something that we think would be more helpful in one of the neighborhoods that most needs some investment. All of this depends on our ability to regard the community as really having something in common, something meaningfully in common that every single resident can have a claim on. Even if we have different economic circumstances, different backgrounds, live in different neighborhoods, care about different things, what is it that makes us all part of this city? Because, of course, whatever that character is the biggest thing that I'm responsible for preserving and contributing to. And that can be more of an emotional thing at times, a sense of civic pride, but it can be a very specifically measurable thing, too, in terms of whether people who live in our city and work in our city are better off because they're here and not some other place. So that, I think, is the biggest philosophical puzzle, is what does it mean to be a resident of South Bend, beyond an address? When I'm talking about the interests of residents, what does it actually mean? And how do you resolve differences of opinion among people who the only thing they may have in common is the fact that they live in the same city and that we share this city?
So where do you look to give a city an identity? I mean, this is an issue that we've been struggling a lot with in our class for individual people. Like, where do you look to kind of find the meaning or identity of what I'm doing? When you're doing it for 100,000 people, where are some sources or some ideas that you start to get for solving that problem?
Well, it's imminent, right? You find it from encountering the city in all of its different faces and asking people what matters to them, and watching how the city responds to different opportunities or crises or challenges. I think the character of a city is something that only really is visible when it's being tested in some way, whether it's a natural disaster and the way the city responds when we have a ferocious snowstorm, or whether it's taking our place in the midst of an economic national emergency like we had in the last decade, and in many senses have been living through for the last 50, 60 years in this part of the country. I think that's when what we would call character, collective character, begins to emerge. And in our city, I think it has to do with a combination of respecting tradition but innovating and questioning habit. And I think it has to do with a kind of work ethic and a willingness to invest labor and sweat in making things better than they were. But the only way to find it is to go out and listen, and then occasionally step back up to the mountaintop and try to fit it into one big picture. And the beautiful thing about the democratic process is if you're ever out of tune with the overall mood or will of the city has a way of letting you know about it pretty quick.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for talking with us about this.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.